Peter fell in weakness, but rose in spiritual power. There are moments in life when everything you believed about yourself collapses in a single instant. Moments when the strength you thought defined you is revealed as fragile, when the courage you once displayed fades into fear, and when the identity you built around your loyalty is shaken by your own actions. It is in those moments, those deeply human moments, that the true story of transformation begins. The story of Peter is not merely the story of a disciple, it is the story of every believer who has ever been confident in their faith, only to discover their weakness. It is the story of falling, of breaking, of confronting the unbearable truth about oneself, and then rising again, not in human strength, but in spiritual power. Peter was not weak because he denied Jesus. Peter became strong because he was broken enough to be rebuilt by God. Before the fall, Peter believed his strength came from his devotion. After the fall, Peter understood that his strength came from surrender. Before the fall, he trusted his courage. After the fall, he trusted God. And this is the paradox of spiritual transformation. The greatest strength is born from the deepest weakness. The man who once swore he would die for Christ became the man who feared being associated with him. The voice that once declared, "Even if all fall away, I will never fall away," became the voice that said, "I do not know the man." And yet that same man would later stand before rulers, prisons and death itself without fear. What changed? What transformed a fearful man into an unshakable pillar of spiritual power? The answer lies not in Peter's strength, but in his failure. Because failure, in the hands of God, is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your true identity. Many believers misunderstand spiritual strength. They believe strength means never failing, never doubting, never falling. But God does not build his strongest warriors from those who never fall. He builds them from those who fall and surrender. He builds them from those who are stripped of their illusions, those who are forced to confront their human weakness, those who realize they cannot stand without him. Peter's fall was not the destruction of his destiny. It was the doorway to his transformation. And perhaps, in ways you have never realized, his story is also your story. Because you too have faced moments of weakness. You too have faced moments when fear spoke louder than faith. You too have faced moments when you felt like you failed God, failed yourself, and failed your calling. But what if those moments were not your end? What if they were your beginning? What if your greatest fall was not the proof of your weakness, but the preparation for your spiritual power? This is the story of Peter. This is the story of falling in weakness and rising in spiritual power. And this is the story of what God does with those who are broken enough to be transformed. The illusion of spiritual strength before the fall. Before Peter fell, he believed he was strong. He believed his loyalty was unbreakable. He believed his courage was permanent. He believed his devotion was enough to carry him through any trial. And this belief was not born from arrogance alone. It was born from experience. Peter had walked with Jesus. He had seen miracles. He had stepped out onto the water while others remained in the boat. He had witnessed the impossible become reality. He had declared, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He was not an outsider. He was not a distant observer. He was at the center of everything. And this proximity to divine power created something dangerous within him. Not true spiritual strength, but the illusion of spiritual strength. The illusion of spiritual strength is one of the most dangerous states a believer can experience because it feels real, it feels stable, it feels unshakable, but it is built on human confidence rather than divine dependence. Peter believed he was strong because he had been faithful in the past. He believed he was strong because he had done what others had not done. He believed he was strong because he loved Jesus deeply. But spiritual strength is not proven in moments of comfort. It is revealed in moments of fear. It is not proven when you are surrounded by support. It is revealed when you are alone. It is not proven when faith is easy. It is revealed when faith costs you everything. And Peter had not yet faced that moment. He had not yet faced the moment when standing with Jesus would threaten his safety. He had not yet faced the moment when loyalty would require sacrifice. He had not yet faced the moment when fear would test his identity. And so he believed he was stronger than he truly was. This is why, when Jesus told the disciples that they would fall away, Peter responded with absolute certainty. He said, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." This was not hesitation. This was not doubt. This was certainty. This was confidence. This was conviction. But it was conviction in himself, not yet conviction in God. Jesus responded with words that would shatter Peter's self-image. He said, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Imagine hearing those words. Imagine being told that you would betray the very person you loved most. Imagine being told that your confidence was an illusion. Peter could not accept it. He could not imagine himself doing such a thing. He responded, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And the other disciples said the same. This moment reveals a profound truth about human nature. We often believe we are stronger than we are. We believe we will stand firm. We believe we will remain faithful. We believe we will never break. But we do not truly know ourselves until we are tested. Peter's confidence was sincere. It was not fake. It was not performative. He genuinely believed he would remain faithful. But sincerity does not equal strength. Emotion does not equal endurance. Passion does not equal stability. Because human strength, no matter how sincere, is fragile. It is vulnerable to fear. It is vulnerable to pressure. It is vulnerable to survival instinct. And Peter was about to discover this reality in the most painful way possible. There is a dangerous stage in every believer's journey where they trust their devotion more than they trust God. They trust their love more than their dependence. They trust their courage more than their surrender. And this stage often comes after spiritual victories, after moments of faith, after moments of obedience, after moments when they feel close to God. But closeness does not eliminate weakness. In fact, sometimes closeness exposes weakness, because the closer you get to your calling, the more your illusions must be destroyed. God cannot build unshakable spiritual strength on unstable human confidence. He must first break the illusion. He must first reveal the truth. He must first allow the fall. Peter did not know that his greatest spiritual transformation would begin with his greatest spiritual failure. He did not know that his confidence would collapse. He did not know that fear would overpower his courage. He did not know that the words, "I do not know him," would come from his own mouth. But Jesus knew. Jesus knew Peter would fall. And yet Jesus still chose him. This reveals one of the most powerful truths in Scripture. God does not choose you because of your strength. He chooses you knowing your weakness. He chooses you knowing your future failures. He chooses you knowing the moments when you will break. And He chooses you not because you are unbreakable, but because He will rebuild you. Peter's illusion of strength was necessary to be broken, because as long as he believed his strength came from himself, he could never experience the true power that comes from dependence on God. Spiritual power is not born from confidence in yourself. It is born from the death of confidence in yourself. It is born from the realization that without God you cannot stand. It is born from surrender. And Peter was about to enter the most painful, transformative and necessary season of his life, the season where his illusion of strength would collapse and his true spiritual power would begin. The night fear conquered his courage. The night air was heavy with tension. The atmosphere itself seemed to carry the weight of something irreversible. This was not just another night. This was the night when illusion would collapse, when confidence would be tested, when identity would be exposed. Only hours earlier, Peter had been full of certainty. His voice had been strong, his conviction unwavering. He had declared his loyalty without hesitation. He had believed with absolute sincerity that he would stand with Jesus no matter what came. But now, everything was different. The garden had shattered that illusion. The soldiers had arrived with torches and weapons. The quiet place of prayer had become the scene of arrest, and Peter, the one who had sworn unwavering loyalty, felt something rising within him that he had never truly faced before. Fear. Fear is one of the most powerful forces that exists within the human soul. It does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it begins as a whisper. Sometimes it begins as a question. Sometimes it begins as a subtle awareness of danger. And when fear begins to grow, it does something that no external enemy can do. It begins to fracture your certainty from within. Peter had drawn his sword in the garden. For a moment his courage had appeared real. He had acted. He had fought. He had resisted. But Jesus had stopped him. Jesus had healed the servant's ear. Jesus had surrendered. And in that moment, Peter's understanding collapsed. Because Peter had been prepared to fight a physical battle. He had not been prepared to face a spiritual surrender. He had been prepared for war. He had not been prepared for sacrifice. And when Jesus allowed himself to be taken, Peter's courage lost its foundation. Because Peter's courage had been connected to his expectation of victory. He believed Jesus would overcome. He believed Jesus would demonstrate power. He believed Jesus would establish his kingdom in visible strength. But now Jesus was being led away like a criminal, bound, silent, submissive. This was not what Peter expected. And when reality does not match expectation, fear finds its opening. The disciples scattered. The unity that had once defined them dissolved into separation. Survival instinct took control. Self-preservation became stronger than loyalty. And Peter, though he followed at a distance, was no longer the same man who had once walked beside Jesus without hesitation. Following at a distance is one of the first signs that fear has begun to reshape your identity. Because distance creates safety. Distance creates deniability. Distance allows you to observe without being seen. Peter still cared. Peter still loved Jesus. But love was now competing with fear, and fear was gaining ground. He entered the courtyard of the high priest. This was enemy territory. This was a place of danger. This was a place where association with Jesus could cost him everything. The fire burned in the center of the courtyard, and people gathered around it. The light of the fire illuminated faces, created shadows, exposed identities. And Peter sat among them, trying to appear like one of them, trying to blend in, trying to disappear. This is what fear does. It convinces you that survival depends on hiding who you truly are. It convinces you that safety depends on silence. It convinces you that distance will protect you, but fear never truly protects. It only delays the moment of confrontation. A servant girl looked at him closely. Her eyes studied his face. Recognition began to form in her expression. And then she spoke the words that would begin Peter's fall. She said, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." Her words were not violent. Her words were not aggressive. But her words were dangerous because her words exposed Peter's identity. In that moment, Peter stood at a crossroads. He had a choice. He could stand in truth, or he could retreat into fear. He could remain loyal, or he could protect himself. He could embrace his identity, or he could deny it. And Peter, the man who had once declared he would die for Jesus, said, "I do not know what you are talking about." The words left his mouth, and something within him broke. Denial is not just the rejection of truth, it is the rejection of self, because Peter was not only denying Jesus, he was denying the man he believed himself to be. But fear does not stop after the first surrender. Fear grows stronger with every compromise. He moved toward the gateway, hoping distance would restore his safety. But another servant girl saw him. She said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, Peter faced the moment of truth. Again, he faced the choice between courage and fear. And again, fear spoke louder. He denied it again, this time with an oath. "I do not know the man." Notice the progression. The first denial was defensive. The second denial was reinforced with an oath. Fear was deepening its control. Fear was reshaping his identity. Fear was rewriting his story. But fear had not yet finished its work. Those standing nearby came up to Peter. They said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Now Peter was surrounded. Now escape seemed impossible. Now exposure was unavoidable. And Peter did something that would have been unimaginable only hours earlier. He began to call down curses. He swore to them, "I do not know the man." This was the third denial. This was the complete collapse of his illusion of strength. This was the moment when fear fully conquered his courage, and immediately the rooster crowed. The sound cut through the night like a blade. It was not just a sound, it was a revelation. It was the sound of prophecy fulfilled. It was the sound of truth exposed. It was the sound of Peter confronting himself. In that moment, time seemed to stop. And then, according to the Gospel of Luke, something happened that would define Peter's transformation forever. Jesus turned and looked at Peter. That look contained no anger. That look contained no condemnation. That look contained truth. That look contained understanding. That look contained love. And Peter remembered. He remembered the words Jesus had spoken. He remembered his confidence. He remembered his certainty. He remembered his promise. And he realized that he had failed completely, totally, undeniably. Peter went outside and wept bitterly. These were not quiet tears. These were not controlled tears. These were tears born from the collapse of identity, tears born from the confrontation with truth, tears born from the realization that he was not who he believed himself to be. This moment is one of the most important moments in spiritual transformation, because transformation does not begin with strength. It begins with the death of illusion. It begins with the destruction of false confidence. It begins with the confrontation with your true weakness. Peter had believed he was unbreakable. Now he knew he was fragile. Peter had believed he was fearless. Now he knew he was afraid. Peter had believed he was strong. Now he knew he was weak. And yet, this moment was not his end. It was his beginning. Because spiritual power is not built on illusion. It is built on truth. And Peter had finally encountered the truth about himself. The man who wept in the darkness that night was not the same man who had declared his strength hours earlier. That man had died. And in his place, God would begin to build someone new. Someone whose strength would no longer come from confidence in himself. Someone whose strength would come from complete dependence on God. Fear had conquered his courage, but fear would not define his destiny. Because God was not finished with Peter, and what was about to rise from the ashes of his failure would become one of the most powerful examples of spiritual transformation the world has ever seen. The crushing weight of failure and the death of the old identity. There is a kind of pain that comes not from what others do to you, but from what you discover about yourself. It is the pain of realization, the pain of seeing clearly what you were blind to before, the pain of watching the image you had of yourself collapse under the weight of truth. This is the pain Peter carried as he walked away from the courtyard into the darkness of that night. The sound of the rooster still echoed in his mind. The look in Jesus' eyes was still burned into his memory. And the words he had spoken, "I do not know the man," repeated themselves inside him like a wound that would not close. This was not just regret. This was the death of the person he believed himself to be. Until that night, Peter's identity had been built on his perceived loyalty. He was the bold one. He was the courageous one. He was the one who spoke when others remained silent. He was the one who stepped forward. He was the one who declared truth with confidence. He was the one who said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." His identity was intertwined with his strength, but now that identity had been shattered, because when the moment came, he had not stood. When the test came, he had not endured. When the cost became real, he had retreated. And there is nothing more devastating than realizing you are capable of becoming the very person you believed you would never be. Failure has a way of stripping away illusion. It removes the mask. It exposes what is hidden. It reveals the truth that confidence alone cannot sustain you. Peter had not planned to deny Jesus. He had not intended to betray his loyalty. But intention is not the same as endurance. Emotion is not the same as stability. And in the absence of true spiritual dependence, human strength always collapses under pressure. As Peter walked into the darkness, he was no longer the man who had once followed Jesus with unshakable certainty. He was now a man confronting his own weakness. And this confrontation is the most painful stage of transformation. Because before God builds you, he allows you to see what you truly are without him. Many believers misunderstand this stage. They interpret failure as rejection. They interpret weakness as disqualification. They interpret their fall as the end of their calling. But in reality, this stage is not destruction. It is preparation. Because God cannot build unshakable spiritual strength on a foundation of self-reliance. He must first remove the illusion that you are strong on your own. Peter's tears were not a sign of defeat. They were a sign that truth had finally reached his soul. The man who had once trusted his own courage was now confronted with the reality of his dependence. And dependence is the birthplace of spiritual power. But at that moment, Peter did not yet understand this. All he understood was the weight of his failure. All he understood was the unbearable awareness of what he had done. He had not been forced to deny Jesus. He had chosen to. This realization is what makes failure so painful, because it reveals that weakness is not always imposed from outside. Sometimes it comes from within. Sometimes it comes from fear that already existed beneath the surface, fear that had never been tested, fear that had never been exposed, fear that had never been confronted until now. Peter had believed he was ready to die for Jesus, but now he understood something deeper. He understood that willingness in theory is not the same as endurance in reality, and this realization destroyed his confidence in himself. But this destruction was necessary, because the version of Peter that relied on his own strength could never fulfill the destiny God had prepared for him. The old identity had to die so the new identity could be born. There is a moment in every spiritual transformation where you must confront the death of who you thought you were, the death of your illusion, the death of your false confidence, the death of your self-reliance. And this death feels like loss, it feels like emptiness, it feels like disorientation, because the identity you trusted is no longer there. Peter was now standing in that emptiness. The bold disciple was gone. The confident follower was gone. The man who had declared his unbreakable loyalty was gone. And in his place stood a man who knew his weakness, a man who knew his fragility, a man who knew he could fall. This is the place where many believers lose hope, because they believe God can only use the strong. They believe God can only use the faithful. They believe God can only use the unbroken. But Scripture reveals a different truth. God specializes in using the broken, because brokenness creates dependence. Brokenness removes pride. Brokenness creates space for divine strength to enter where human strength has failed. Peter did not yet know that his failure had not disqualified him. He did not yet know that his fall had not surprised God. He did not yet know that Jesus had already seen this moment and still chosen him. All he knew was the silence, the absence, the weight of his own actions, the crushing awareness of his weakness. And then something even more devastating happened. Jesus was crucified. The one Peter had followed was now gone. The one who had called him was now dead. The one who had believed in him was now buried. And Peter was left with his failure and no opportunity to fix it, no opportunity to undo it, no opportunity to redeem himself. This is one of the most painful experiences a human soul can endure, the inability to go back, the inability to change what has been done, the inability to restore what has been broken. Peter could not go back to the courtyard and speak differently. He could not go back and stand with courage. He could not erase his denial. The moment was permanent. The words were spoken. The failure was complete. And now he was forced to live with it. This is where true surrender begins. Because as long as you believe you can fix yourself, you remain dependent on your own strength. But when you reach the point where you know you cannot undo your failure, where you know you cannot restore yourself, where you know you cannot rebuild your own identity, you become ready for God to do what you cannot do. Peter had reached the end of himself. The confident man was gone. The self-reliant man was gone. The illusion of strength was gone. And in that emptiness, God was preparing to build something greater. Because spiritual power does not come from the version of you that has never fallen. It comes from the version of you that has fallen and discovered that God did not abandon you. Peter believed his story had ended in failure. He believed his destiny had collapsed. He believed his calling had been destroyed by his own weakness. But what Peter did not yet understand was that God was not finished with him. The death of his old identity was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his transformation. The man who had fallen in weakness would rise in spiritual power. But first, he had to remain in this place of brokenness, because brokenness is where God rebuilds you. Brokenness is where pride dies. Brokenness is where dependence is born. Brokenness is where true spiritual strength begins. The silence of God and the hidden work of restoration. There is a stage in every spiritual transformation that feels like abandonment, a stage where heaven seems silent, where prayers feel like they disappear into emptiness, where the presence that once felt close now feels distant. This silence is one of the most misunderstood experiences in the life of a believer, because silence feels like rejection. Silence feels like absence. Silence feels like the end. And this is the stage Peter entered after the crucifixion of Jesus. The noise of the crowd was gone. The accusations were over. The courtyard was empty. The trial had ended. The cross had done its work. And now there was nothing but silence. Jesus was dead. The voice that had called Peter from the shores of Galilee was silent. The voice that had spoken truth into his identity was silent. The voice that had said, "Follow me," was silent. And Peter was left alone with his thoughts, alone with his memories, alone with his failure. This silence was heavier than any accusation could have been, because accusation at least gives you something to fight against. Silence gives you nothing. Silence forces you to sit with yourself. Silence forces you to confront what you cannot escape, and Peter could not escape the memory of that night. He could not escape the sound of his own voice denying Jesus. He could not escape the look in Jesus' eyes. That look had not been filled with anger. It had been filled with something far more devastating, understanding, because anger would have been easier to bear. Anger would have meant rejection. Anger would have meant separation. But understanding meant that Jesus had known. Jesus had known Peter would fall. Jesus had known Peter would break. Jesus had known Peter would deny him, and yet Jesus had loved him anyway. This realization created a deeper kind of pain, because Peter was now forced to confront the reality that his failure had not been hidden, it had been foreseen, and still he had been chosen. Many believers misunderstand what happens in the silence of God. They assume silence means God has withdrawn. They assume silence means God has turned away. They assume silence means their failure has created distance that cannot be restored. But the silence of God is not the absence of God. It is the place where God does his deepest work. Because transformation rarely happens in noise. It happens in silence. It happens in the hidden places. It happens in the moments where you are stripped of distraction, stripped of illusion, stripped of false identity. Peter was now living in that silence. The man who had once walked beside Jesus now walked without him. The man who had once heard his voice now heard nothing. And in that silence, Peter faced a question that every believer must eventually face. Who are you when everything that defined you has been removed? Who are you when your confidence is gone? Who are you when your strength has failed? Who are you when your identity has collapsed? This is where many people attempt to escape. They attempt to rebuild themselves through activity. They attempt to distract themselves through movement. They attempt to silence their internal confrontation with external noise. But Peter did something different. He returned to fishing. This decision was not random. Fishing was his old life. Fishing was who he had been before Jesus called him. Fishing was familiar. Fishing was safe. Fishing required no spiritual courage. It required no identity confrontation. It allowed him to exist without facing the question of who he had become. This is what many people do after failure. They return to what is familiar. They return to what existed before their calling. Because failure creates the illusion that you are no longer worthy of your destiny. Peter may have believed that his story as a disciple had ended. He may have believed that his failure had permanently disqualified him. He may have believed that the man Jesus called no longer existed, and so he returned to the only identity he believed he still had: fisherman. But what Peter did not understand was that his calling had never been dependent on his perfection. It had always been dependent on God's purpose. And God's purpose is never destroyed by human failure. It is refined through it. The silence Peter experienced was not abandonment. It was preparation. Because before God restores you publicly, he restores you privately. Before God uses you powerfully, he rebuilds you internally. Before God entrusts you with spiritual authority, he ensures your dependence is complete. Peter had once followed Jesus with confidence in himself, but now he existed without confidence, and this was necessary, because the version of Peter that relied on his own strength could never carry the spiritual authority God intended to give him. Human confidence creates unstable leaders, but broken dependence creates unshakable ones. In the silence, Peter's pride was dying. In the silence, his illusion was dissolving. In the silence, his self-reliance was being replaced with humility. The silence was not empty. It was active. It was the place where God was removing everything that could not sustain Peter's future calling. Many believers abandon their spiritual journey in this stage because they interpret silence as rejection. They interpret waiting as abandonment. They interpret the absence of visible restoration as permanent disqualification. But the silence of God is often the greatest evidence that he is preparing you for something greater than you can imagine, because God does not rush transformation. He allows the process to complete its work. He allows the illusion to fully die. He allows dependence to fully form. He allows humility to fully take root. Peter could not yet see what was coming. He could not yet see that the silence was temporary. He could not yet see that restoration was already in motion, because God's restoration often begins before you are aware of it. And soon Peter would encounter something that would change everything. He would encounter the risen Christ. And in that encounter, He would discover that his failure had not ended his story. His failure had prepared him for his true beginning, the moment of restoration and the birth of unshakable spiritual power. The morning did not announce itself with thunder. It did not arrive with spectacle or warning. It came quietly, like most divine moments do. The sun rose over the Sea of Galilee, and its light stretched across the water, touching the surface with gentle authority. The world appeared ordinary. The waves moved as they always had. The air carried the same stillness. The shoreline remained unchanged. But Peter was not the same man. He stood in a boat with the other disciples, performing the task that once defined his life. Fishing. The familiar rhythm of casting nets and pulling them back, the repetition, the silence, the waiting. There was something almost symbolic about this moment. Peter had returned to the place where his story with Jesus had begun. Years earlier, he had stood on these same waters as a fisherman, with no understanding of the destiny that awaited him. And now, he stood again as a fisherman, but this time, he carried the weight of failure, the memory of denial, and the uncertainty of his future. All night, they had caught nothing. The nets remained empty. The effort had produced no result. This emptiness reflected something deeper than physical lack. It reflected the internal condition of Peter's soul, because without divine direction, human effort always leads to emptiness. Without divine presence, activity becomes motion without purpose. And Peter was now living in that emptiness. Then, as morning broke, a figure appeared on the shore. The distance concealed his identity. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" They answered, "No." The response was simple, honest, empty, and then the figure spoke again. "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." These words carried an authority that echoed something familiar, something Peter had heard before, something that reached beyond logic and into memory. They obeyed. They cast the net, and suddenly the emptiness was replaced with overwhelming abundance. The net filled with fish, so many that they could not pull it in. In that moment, recognition ignited. John spoke the words that would change everything. "It is the Lord." Peter did not hesitate. He did not wait. He did not remain in the boat. He jumped into the water. The same man who had once distanced himself from Jesus in fear was now throwing himself toward him without hesitation. This was the first visible evidence that something had changed within him. Fear no longer controlled his movement. Failure no longer defined his identity. He moved toward Jesus, not away from him. This is the first sign of true restoration, when you no longer hide from God, but run toward him, even with the memory of your failure. Peter reached the shore, and there he saw something deeply symbolic. Jesus had prepared a fire. The same element that had illuminated Peter's denial was now present in his restoration, but this fire was different. This fire did not expose his failure. It welcomed him into restoration. Jesus had prepared fish and bread, provision, invitation, presence, and Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." Notice what Jesus did not do. He did not accuse Peter. He did not condemn Peter. He did not force Peter to explain himself, because true restoration does not begin with accusation. It begins with invitation. They ate together. The silence between them carried meaning, not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of completion. And then Jesus spoke. He addressed Peter directly. He called him by his old name. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" This question reached deeper than behavior. It reached identity, because Peter's failure had not been a failure of action alone. It had been a confrontation with the foundation of his devotion. Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus responded, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus asked, "Simon, "Son of John, do you love me?" Peter answered again, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." A third time, Jesus asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt, because the question mirrored his failure. 3 denials, 3 questions, 3 opportunities not to erase the past, but to restore his identity beyond it. Peter answered, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." This moment was not about information. Jesus already knew Peter's heart. This moment was about transformation, because Jesus was not restoring Peter to who he was before his failure. He was restoring him to someone greater. Before his fall, Peter's confidence had been rooted in himself. Now, his identity was rooted in surrender. Before his fall, he believed he was strong. Now, he knew his strength came from God. Before his fall, he had trusted his courage. Now he trusted God's grace. This is the difference between human strength and spiritual power. Human strength is built on confidence. Spiritual power is built on dependence. Human strength collapses under pressure. Spiritual power remains unshakable because it does not rely on human stability. Jesus then spoke words that revealed Peter's future. He told him that one day he would stretch out his hands, and others would lead him where he did not want to go. This was a prophecy of Peter's eventual martyrdom. The man who had once feared death would one day face it without fear. The man who had once denied Jesus to save himself would one day surrender his life for him. And then Jesus spoke the same words that had begun Peter's journey years earlier. "Follow me." This invitation was not revoked by failure. It was renewed through restoration. And this reveals the most powerful truth of Peter's story. Failure does not cancel your calling. Failure clarifies your dependence. Failure destroys the illusion that your calling depends on your strength. It reveals that your calling depends on God's purpose. From that moment forward, Peter was no longer the man he had once been. The man who stood before the fire in the courtyard had been driven by fear, but the man who now stood before Jesus was driven by surrender, and surrender created unshakable spiritual power. This power would soon be revealed, because the same Peter who once denied Jesus before a servant girl would soon stand before rulers and authorities and proclaim his name without fear. The same Peter who once hid in fear would soon lead thousands into faith. The same Peter who once fell in weakness would rise in spiritual power, and his strength would never again come from confidence in himself. It would come from the Spirit of God within him. This is the paradox of transformation. God does not use the version of you that has never fallen. He uses the version of you that has fallen and discovered that his grace is greater than your failure. Peter fell in weakness, but he rose in spiritual power, and because of that, his story did not end in denial. It ended in destiny.